Smith in the KHU 11 newsroom as we follow breaking news. Texas House Democrats are set to speak in Washington, D.C. any moment now. They left the state less than 24 hours ago to avoid passage of a controversial voting law during the special session. We are waiting for them to all come to the podium now. We know more than 50 House Democrats jumped on 2 chartered planes to Washington, D.C. yesterday. They're pushing Congress to pass federal voting laws. That's what we expect to hear from them today. We have heard that they plan to stay until the special session that was called is over on August 6th. The reason they've left the state is because 2/3 of the 150-member chamber, the Texas House, must be present in order for the House to conduct business. With more than 50 House Democrats out of the state, the House cannot vote on these voting bills. We're talking about Senate Bill 1 and House Bill 3. You might remember House Democrats also walked out at the end of the legislative session in May. That is what prompted this special session that adjourned on July 8th. And this isn't a new tactic for Texas Democrats. Back in 1979, a group of 12 Democratic senators walked out. They were rounded up by DPS. The lieutenant governor back then ordered DPS to get them back at the Capitol. Then in 1993, House Democrats, again, 52 of them, were protesting a redistricting plan that was pushed by Republicans, so they fled to Oklahoma. Now we're seeing a very similar situation play out. This is the first time that we know of, though, that House Democrats have gone as far as Washington, D.C. to make their case. Again, we are getting ready to hear from those House Democrats, at least 50 of them waking up in the nation's capital. We have a crew there in D.C. They spoke to some of the Democrats as they got ready for this press conference. We hope to hear from reporter Matt Doherty after we hear from House Democrats. We're also going to share some comments with you from Governor Abbott. He spoke to our sister station, KVUE, in Austin yesterday and said the House Speaker can call on DPS to arrest the lawmakers. There is some question, though, about what happens when they are out of state. So we have verified what's possible and what's not. We will jump into that segment as soon as we hear from Democrats. They were slated to start speaking at 9 o'clock this morning. Again, you are looking at a live shot from the nation's capital where at least 50 Texas lawmakers have been since last night. They chartered 2 planes to get there.
Thank you
and
very
we are
much,
listening in now.
For being here this morning. And first of all, I want to thank all of our friends, the Democrats in the Texas legislature, for doing the right thing, coming to Washington, D.C. to really shine light on what's a very glaring topic, a very important topic in our country, and that's the eroding of voting rights. Since 1965, since the Voting Rights Act was passed in the mid-60s, we have not seen this level of retrogression in the right to people to cast their votes since that time period. And people need to do something about it. And this group is here today exactly doing that. They're doing something about it. They're standing up and they're doing the right thing. Congressman Doggett and I are very happy to host them here at the Triangle today. The first person that you're going to hear from is Chris Turner, who's the chair of the House Democratic Caucus in Austin. He represents Tarrant County, but we're happy to have all of these courageous members here today. They made big sacrifices to be here today. These members all come from a variety of different districts. Some of them come from, in D.C., what we will call frontline districts. And they're making a sacrifice so all Americans, regardless of their race, their income, their party affiliation, will have equal access to the ballot. And that is what this is about. Before I turn it over to Chris, would like for Congressman Doggett to also have a few words, and then the next person you hear from after Lloyd will be Chris.
We'll wrap this up at the end, but clearly they brought the Texas heat along with the Texas courage. We're glad all of you are out. We are here to honor them and their courage. They're focused not just on what's happening in Texas, but what is happening right over there in the United States Senate. It is a time for bold action, the same kind of bold action and courage we need in the United States Senate and from this administration that these Texas colleagues of ours are demonstrating by their action. Chris, we're so pleased you're here. Thank you for your leadership.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Congressman Vesey, Congressman Doggett, and our entire Texas congressional delegation, all of whom just do such a fabulous job of representing the Lone Star State here in our nation's capital, fighting for the people of Texas every single day. We can't thank you enough, and thank you for hosting us here this morning. My name is Chris Turner. I am the chair of the Texas House Democratic Caucus. I'm a state representative from Grand Prairie, Texas, in the Dallas-Fort Worth region. As you just heard, more than 50 Democratic members of the Texas House have left Texas to stop Republicans from passing the latest iteration of their voter suppression legislation. And you're going to hear primarily from some of my colleagues today because we have so many strong voices in our caucus. We want to give them the opportunity to speak to the public. But just for everyone's awareness, procedurally how this works is there's 150 members of the Texas House. It takes 2/3 of the body present to constitute a quorum, so 100 members. And we vote in Texas, and we register our attendance by use of voting machines on our desks. And minutes ago, at least 57 letters were delivered to the House Journal Clerk directing the House to lock our voting machines and not unlock them until we provide express permission to do so upon our return to the Capitol. So with that, it's my privilege now to introduce a great fighter, a longtime advocate in the fight for voting rights, my good friend, the chairman of the Mexican American Legislative Caucus from Dallas, Texas, Rafael Anchia.
Para los medios de comunicación de habla hispana, quiero proveer unas palabras en español al inicio para no solamente reiterar lo que dijo mi colega, el presidente del grupo de demócratas, Chris Turner, pero también para platicar directamente con el público. Este grupo de legisladores que representan cada rincón del estado de Texas necesitaban salir desde el principio para proteger el derecho de voto de todos tejanos. No importa si eres hispano, afroamericano, anglosajón, republicano, demócrata, católico o protestante. Nosotros teníamos que salir para proteger el voto. El gobernador Abbott ha intentado desarrollar una agenda anti-inmigrante, anti-hispana, antidemocrático. Y empezó por quitar el dinero para la Cámara de Diputados y el Senado. Vetar el dinero que viene para la rama legislativa, que es algo que se ve en otros países, pero en los Estados Unidos no se ve. Es decir, un gobernador no se puede convertir en un rey. Él tiene que respetar las cortes, tiene que respetar la rama legislativa, y no lo ha hecho. Así es que al inicio de esta sesión legislativa empezó mal, empezó envenenado, y nosotros no íbamos a participar en ese proceso antidemocrático. So I also speak English, and I will offer you a few words. As the chair of the Mexican American Legislative Caucus, my name is Rafael Anchia. I represent Dallas, and I have the honor of representing the 40-plus members of the oldest and largest Latino legislative caucus in America, which is the Mexican American Legislative Caucus. And you will see prominent members of our caucus standing with me today who have fought for voting rights over the decades. I just want to offer that at the outset of this legislative session, the process was poisoned. And it was poisoned by a governor who defunded the legislative branch in violation of both our state constitution, which has very specific language about separation of powers, and also what has been developed under the jurisprudence of our U.S. Constitution. When you start the process in such a coercive way, when you say, I am going to be the absolute ruler of the state of Texas and defund the legislative branch, you have poisoned the entire process. And we, as Democrats, we were united. We said we are going to kill any undemocratic efforts in the state legislature. And if that meant leaving the state, we were going to do it. Now, you have probably looked long and hard at the legislation that has been offered just in recent times, legislation that would make it harder for Texans to exercise their freedom of vote and their right to vote. And we're not doing this for Democrats. We're doing this for Republicans. We're doing this for independents. We're doing this for North Texans and South Texans and East and West Texans. We're doing this for Catholics and Protestants. Anybody in the state of Texas who needs to exercise the right to vote should do so freely. And we are not going to buckle to the big lie in the state of Texas. The big lie that has resulted in anti-democratic legislation throughout the United States. We said no when the big lie came to the Capitol in Texas and darkened our door. We said no during the regular session, and we are saying no during the regular session. We are happy to work on bipartisan proposals that expand the right to vote, that make it easier to vote and harder to cheat in the state of Texas. But that is not what we saw even at the outset of this process, when none of the amendments offered by my colleagues were considered in committee. So we said, and we took the very difficult decision. We are not here smiling. We are not spiking the ball. We are not saying that we are happy. In fact, we are sad for democracy in the state of Texas. And we took a solemn oath to protect the Constitution of the United States and to protect the Constitution of the state of Texas. And that is why we stand united before you here today in preserving not only the democracy in Texas, but the democracy of the United States. Thank you for your time. And next, I'd like to, if she has arrived, call up the chair, or the vice chair rather, of the House Democratic Caucus, Tony Rose. And in her absence, I would then like to call Representative Retta Bowers, my colleague from Dallas County. Welcome.
Thank you, Chairman Anchia, and thank you for being here today. I used to live here in Washington, and I worked like you for the press, for PBS and WETA, and it is a proud, pleasing moment to be back here with my colleagues as a member of the Texas House. We are here in D.C., our nation's capital, because we want to protect the civil right to vote for millions of Texans. We were quite literally forced to move and leave the state of Texas. We also know that we are living right now on borrowed time in Texas. And we can't stay here indefinitely to run out the clock, to stop Republican anti-voter bills. That's why we need Congress to act now and pass the For the People Act. Texas Democrats will use everything in our power to fight back, but we need Congress to act now. And at this time, I'm going to call up. She's here. She's on.
Oh, yeah, I'll take it.
Chairman Turner.
Thank you. Thank you, Representative Bowers, on behalf of the Texas Legislative Black Caucus and Chairman Anchia, on behalf of the Mexican American Legislative Caucus. Let me now hand it back over to our congressional leaders, Congressman Vesey and Congressman Doggett.
Tony's coming. She's coming now. She's coming.
Actually, Tony's coming. She's walking up. Okay. Yeah. Okay. I know everyone familiar with Capitol Hill knows there's security protocols, so we had a couple members get hung up, but Representative Tony Rose is approaching. Tony is a representative from Dallas. She serves as the first vice chair of the House Democratic Caucus, and she's our dear friend and a leader in our caucus, and I invite her up to speak here. Representative Tony Rose.
Ooh. Thank you. You know, Republicans have failed Texans. Texas Republicans don't want free and fair elections. House Bill 3 puts deliberate barriers to voting to make it harder for Texans to cast just a free, safe, and equally vote. House Bill 3 is an attack on voters' freedoms and democracy. Even with two ruthless provisions removed, the bill, as written, makes it harder for Texans to vote and easier for partisan poll watchers to harass and intimidate voters. Right. Greg Abbott wants the spotlight anywhere but on his failures, rigging the system, attacking the very foundation of democracy and the rights of all Texans in the price of the GOP-led legislature. It's the price they're willing to pay in order to pay for Trump's prayer altar. So we have real issues to address in Texas that Greg Abbott won't touch because it exposes his weaknesses. He has done nothing to protect the electric grid, even after 700 people died due to his negligence during the recent winter storms. But Democrats, we stand ready at all times to work on real issues. Right. Thank you.
All right. Good job. Tony.
And before we hear from our congressional members again, it's my honor to introduce the Dean of the Texas House Democratic Caucus, Representative Sinfronia Thompson from Houston.
I'm going to tell you why I'm up here. I'm not up here to take a vacation in Washington, D.C. When I look at the African American Museum, I thought about the struggle of my people fought in this country to get the right to vote.
That's right.
And that right is sacred to my constituent that I represent back in Houston, Texas.
Right.
And I'm up here because I don't plan to be a sitting person in that legislature. I'm not going to be a sitting.
You ain't no sitting duck.
I'm not going to be a hostage. That my constituents' right to be stripped from them. We have fought too long and too hard in this country. And there was a Texan called Johnson, President Lyndon B. Johnson, August the 6th of 1965, that made sure that we had the right to vote. And those rights was not going to be infringed upon. But this legislature may have, these Republicans in this legislature may have changed the Messiah, Jesus, to Trump, but I haven't. And I'm going to make sure that everything that I can do, that my constituents' right would not be stripped from them because of what they believe in is a lie. Trump lost the election.
Yes, he did.
And they need to tell the people of this country the truth. And if they won't, I'm going to.
So let me hand it back to our members of Congress with the caveat that's going to be a difficult act to follow, with all due respect to Congressman Vesey and Congressman Doggett.
Chris, thank you very much. Ms. Thompson, thank you very much. And, you know, when I think about Ms. Thompson, she didn't really tell you her entire story. We served in the state legislature together. And when she was elected to the state legislature, it was really right after all of the civil rights bills in the 1960s were passed. Shortly thereafter, when state legislators still had to be elected countywide, where we were just getting rid of poll taxes and the barriers that made it harder for people to vote. And it's a shame that today, in 2021, that we are revisiting the past. And that's exactly what we're doing. If they tell you otherwise and they're always, oh, that's nothing, anybody can do that, that's not that big of a deal, it is. And they wouldn't be doing this if they didn't think it would have a negative outcome on particularly brown and black voters in the state of Texas and in the other states that are doing similar style legislation. That's why, as a member of Congress, I founded the Congressional Voting Rights Caucus, because you could see these things for the last 10, 15, 20 years starting to rear its ugly head again. And, you know, with that, I want to be 100% clear. Now, not later, not sometime in the future, now, we need to pass the John Lewis Voting Rights Act.
Yes.
It needs to be signed into law, and we also need to pass H.R. 1. Our citizens can't wait any longer. And I want to echo what our majority whip here in the U.S. House, Jim Clyburn, talked about when he mentioned a carve-out for H.R. 4, the John Lewis Voting Rights Act. If Mitch McConnell did a carve-out for Amy Coney Barrett, then we ought to do a carve-out for the black and brown people that live in Texas and that live in Georgia, that live in Florida, that live in all these states that are trying to make it harder for our constituents to exercise their right to vote. We need to get this done today. Time is of the essence. We cannot wait. States are going to start to ramp up these efforts. Again, Texas has called Governor Abbott has called the legislature back into session to start working on these things. You're going to see the most racist redistricting that you've seen since the Voting Rights Act outlawed things like at-large districts. And we need something to help protect the brave men and women that you see standing behind me here today that are risking so much for voting rights in this country. And before I turn it over to Congressman Doggett, I just want Greg Abbott and the Republican leaders in Texas, Florida, Georgia, and anywhere else to know that we are not going to stop. We are always going to push back against these sort of bigoted, racist, Jim Crow 2.0 style voting laws whenever you decide to bring them up. Congressman Doggett.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Chris, and all of you who have spoken. You know, most of the focus around here these days is about infrastructure. And it's right that we should focus on crumbling bridges. But today we're here about something much more important, and that is the infrastructure of democracy, about broken voting rights. These courageous colleagues chose not to be accomplices by sitting at their desk and being steamrollered in Austin. It took courage to do what they're doing. I served also with Dean Sinfronia Thompson at a time I was a killer bee when 12 of us chose to depart and won a victory on an issue involving election integrity. They have a much bigger challenge because unlike the position we were in decades ago, no matter what they do, Greg Abbott and his group of extremists will never change. What can change is right here in this building. And as Dean Thompson mentioned, what we really need today is a Lyndon Johnson moment. We need the power of the presidency, a great outline in an op-ed in yesterday's Post about other things President Biden can do. We need the president and the vice president and every Democrat in this Senate working together to preserve American democracy. There has seldom been more at stake. That's why they're here. We need to see in the administration and in the Senate the same courage that these Texans have demonstrated. That Lyndon Johnson moment. Remember how difficult it was to pass over so much objection of Voting Rights Act in 1965. When we gathered, Chris, there in Austin, Lucy Baines Johnson was one of our most powerful speakers, telling about standing at the desk when President Johnson signed that Voting Rights Act. We want to be standing there when a new Voting Rights Act for this century is there, and the rights that were struggled, that so many lives were taken, so much courage was demonstrated, are preserved once again. I turn it back over to you for the questions, and thank you very much for all that you and all of your colleagues are doing here today.
Thank you. We will overcome. We will overcome. We will overcome someday. Deep in our heart, I do believe we will overcome someday.
Thank you, Ms. T. Thank you, members of Congress. We'll take a few questions.
You guys, a number of y'all were here a few weeks ago lobbying members of Congress to act on any of these federal voting rights legislation. The bill still didn't pass muster in the Senate. What'll be different this time?
Sure. Well, democracy's hard, and you know we don't expect anything up here to be easy. But look, we had productive meetings a few weeks ago. Those of us who were here, we, as Trey Martinez-Fisher said last night, we brought some reinforcements this time. And you know, look, after we were here, you saw all 50 Democrats in the U.S. Senate coalesce behind a version of H.R. 1. That was we're not taking credit for that necessarily, but the progress was made. Okay, and we think those discussions we had helped inform that discussion. And so now, as Congressman Doggett just said, we really want to drill down on the importance of the Democratic leader Clyburn's comments about a carve-out on the filibuster. with respect to voting rights. I mean, if we can't, if they can, as Congressman Vesey just said, if you can have a carve out for a right-wing Supreme Court justice, why can't you have a carve out to protect the very fundamentals of our democracy?
Representative Turner. Governor Abbott has already said that, or essentially made it clear that even if that ends up expiring, he's just going to call another session. So are you going to keep on doing this over and over and over again?
Yeah, we know that's exactly what he's going to do. We went into this eyes wide open. We know exactly what will happen. Rick Perry did the same thing many years ago in another similar situation. So what our message is very simple. Like Chairman Anchia said a minute ago, our intent is to stay out and kill this bill this session and use the intervening time, I think 24, 25 days now, before the end of this session, to implore the folks in this building behind us to pass federal voting rights legislation to protect voters in Texas and across the country.
Representative Turner, with regards to politics, you just said it's really hard, but it also takes compromises for decision. What are you prepared with the caucus to give back to say, let's get to the table and hammer this out?
Oh, with respect to the Republicans in Austin? Well, the first thing that needs to happen is Governor Abbott needs to stand down on his unconstitutional veto of the legislative branch of government. Right. And we haven't talked about that a lot this morning, but this caucus is pursuing action in the Texas Supreme Court because we believe what he did is unconstitutional. So the first place to start would be for the governor to stand down on that, and then we can start talking.
What is it by, what your home state senator, Senator Cornyn, called this nothing but a publicity stunt. What do you say to him and others who were saying that?
You said John Cornyn said that this was a publicity stunt? Well, okay. I hadn't seen that. But I think our two U.S. senators wrote the book on publicity stunts. And what I would say to Senator Cornyn is we'd encourage him to work in a bipartisan manner, as the people of Texas elected him to do, to pass voting rights legislation to protect 30 million Texans that he says he represents. Last question.
Congressman Doggett mentioned the open table in the White House. Are you happy with the amount that you see from President Biden and Vice President Harris? No.
Look, a number of us had the privilege of having a very good meeting with Vice President Harris a few weeks ago, where she thanked all the Democrats in the Texas House and Senate for our strong stand against these Republican vote suppression efforts. And she reiterated her commitment and the president's commitment to continuing to do all they could. We're looking forward to seeing what the president says today in his speech on voting rights in Philadelphia. And we hope what we'll hear is an even stronger commitment and a clear plan of action as to how we can break the gridlock in the Senate and pass federal legislation immediately this summer. We have a short window here. As was previously mentioned, this session ends on August 7th, and we can't hold this tide back forever. We're buying some time. We need Congress and all of our federal leaders to use that time wisely. Thank you all very much.
Great job, Chris.
Okay.
Appreciate you. Yeah, that was good.
On the steps of the U.S. Capitol, more than 50 Texas House Democrats made their case for what they call a very important topic, voting rights. We first heard from Texas congressmen, and included in that was Lloyd Doggett. He is significant because, as he mentioned, he was part of that group of 12 senators back in 1979 who walked out to avoid voting on election-related bills, and that's when the then Lieutenant Governor ordered DPS to round them up. Doggett and Congressman Mark Vesey both made the case for Congress to pass H.R. 1. That's the voting rights bill. House Democrats, as you know now, left the state about 24 hours ago to avoid passage of a couple different bills that are making their way through the state legislature. Senate Bill 1 and House Bill 3. Both of those pieces of legislation restrict voting rights. They rein in local initiatives like drive-through voting, 24-hour voting. They tighten vote-by-mail restrictions, and they provide more access for poll watchers. Of course, we have much more on that legislation on khou.com. But hearing from the state representatives. State Rep. Rafael Anchia, he says out on the outset, this special session was poisoned because of Governor Abbott. He says Democrats are not doing this for other Democrats. They're doing it for Republicans, for independents, for all Texans to have voting rights. He says he's happy to work on bipartisan efforts, but he said that no Democratic amendments to this proposed legislation even were considered in committee. We also heard from Houston's representative, State Rep. Sophronia Thompson. She says, I am not going to be held hostage. She says we have fought too long and too hard in this country. Her comments, my constituents will not be stripped of their rights. So we just heard from a whole lot of Republicans. What do Republicans have to say about the Democrats leaving for Washington, D.C.? Governor Abbott spoke to our sister station, KVUE, in Austin last night. Here's what he said when asked for his message about this issue.
We do have a message, and we also have a message for your audience, and that is your audience is paying for this junket trip that they're taking to get away from Austin while they're not here doing business. This is costing taxpayer money, but even worse, is wreaking damage on your community. There are important issues that we wanted to get past, such as taking care and funding children who are working their way through the foster care system. We wanted to provide extra check for retired teachers who desperately need that money to help pay their bills. We wanted to provide additional law enforcement to high crime areas like what you have seen in the Dallas area, for example. And also we wanted to deliver property tax relief. Your property taxes are going through the roof in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. And we wanted to pass property tax reform. We can do none of those things because of this junket. The Democrats wanted to just abandon their job, not do their job, but expect to get paid for it. Well, as the earlier commentator was talking about, listen, I can call special session after special session after special session until we get these items passed. We can be in a special session all the way up through the election of next year. And speaking of which, there's some people in your viewing area who could lose their job because they're not going back to work. You have Representative Beckley, you have Representative Meza, you have Representative Bowers, you have Representative Niavi, all of whom are in very close races, and their constituents need to understand that they are not delivering on these issues that are so important to their communities. Here's the deal. If you look at the issues, there is no need or reason to compromise. Listen, let's look at the voter integrity issue that they're supposedly running from. Listen, it does not eliminate anybody's ability or right to vote. Their arguments are completely bogus. Texas is adding hours, not subtracting hours to voting. Texas is making it easier to vote than ever before. This is all just an attempt to make a scene out of something about a non-existent issue because, of course, Texas has the right to vote for everybody and far more ability to vote than, for example, what you see in Delaware. There's exactly 0 hours of voting, and I mentioned Delaware because that, of course, is where President Biden is from. So my point is this. There is no compromising. Everyone has to get back and get to work. The people who employ these representatives, your viewers, they shouldn't compromise for anything. I can and I will continue to call special session after special session after special session all the way up until election next year. And so if these people want to be hanging out wherever they're hanging out on this taxpayer-paid junket, they're going to have to be prepared to do it for well over a year. As soon as they come back in the state of Texas, they will be arrested. They will be cabined inside the Texas Capitol until they get their job done.
All right, you just heard Governor Abbott say that he would arrest those lawmakers. But is that true? Can he actually do that? Our Verify team did some digging to find out. Here's Stephanie Simmons.
You may have seen posts like this one on social media that Texas Democrats risk being arrested for preventing a quorum. First up, our sources. We went straight to the Texas House rules for the 87th legislature. It's pretty dry reading, but here's what it says. All absentees for whom no sufficient excuse is made may, by order of a majority of those present, be sent for and arrested wherever they may be found by the Sergeant-at-Arms or an officer appointed by the Sergeant-at-Arms for that purpose, and their attendance shall be secured and retained. So yes, we can verify Texas lawmakers in the House can be arrested for not showing up and preventing a quorum. Now for some context. If the Texas Rangers are tapped to make these arrests, as they have been in the past, their jurisdiction ends at the Texas border. According to the FAME agency's website, they often work with law enforcement in other jurisdictions. But in a politically sensitive situation like this, getting interagency cooperation could be tough.
That was Stephanie Simmons reporting. KHU 11 reporter Matt Doherty followed the Democrats to Washington, D.C. last night. We are going to check in with him as soon as we can. But what we can tell you now is that more than 50 Texas House Democrats jumped on 2 charter planes last night bound for Washington, D.C. We just heard from them at a press conference. Included in that press conference were Texas Congressman Mark Vesey and Lloyd Doggett. Lloyd Doggett was one of the killer bees back in 1979, one of 12 Texas senators who performed a very similar action. These Democrats say that they are buying time for Congress to pass H.R. 1. It's a voting rights bill. They say they will stay in Washington, D.C. until the end of this special session that began on July 8th. They will stay until August 6th or 7th when it ends. Now, Governor Abbott has threatened to call another special session. He says he can continue to call special sessions until the next election. That's why Democrats say, knowing that, they say they went into this eyes wide open, that they are simply buying time, about 25 days, for Congress to work on passing H.R. 1 so that these types of issues aren't faced by states such as Texas. Running this down again, we know there were 2 chartered planes to Washington, D.C. last night. Those lawmakers plan to stay until August 6th, and the reason is because the Texas House cannot have a quorum. In order for the Texas House to pass any legislation, it needs 2/3 of its 150 members to be in the chamber. With more than 50 House Democrats leaving, they cannot do that. We now have reporter Matt Doherty in Washington, D.C. He spoke to some of the lawmakers ahead of this press conference. Matt?
Hey, Brandy. I was listening to the summary that you were giving just a little bit ago, and it's, you gave a great roundup of what's happening out here. So basically, the Texas legislatures are here today to petition the United States Congress, trying to ask them to pass some type of legislation while they can, because the special session in Texas has been called off since all those Democrats fled to D.C., so they can't pass anything right now. That special session is going to end sometime in August, sometime in the beginning of August. I think it's something like 22 days or something. So in that time, what these legislators from Texas are asking Congress to do is to pass some type of comprehensive voting legislation that would, basically override whatever it is that the Texas legislators are trying to pass right now. So we learned last night that they're going to be here. They said, for the next 3 weeks. Governor Greg Abbott has said that, once they come back to Texas, they're going to be arrested and brought back to the Texas legislature, where he's going to call another special session. But the Democrats here today say that, they're just going to keep doing this to prevent this legislation from being passed. So anyway, there's going to be some more developments probably today, because President Biden is expected to give a speech in Philadelphia, which is going to, address some of these voting legislations or voter legislations that are being debated and passed in some other states across the country. That's coming up in a little bit, so it'll be interesting to find out what he has to say about all of this. Democrats here today are calling it his Lyndon Johnson moment to stand up and strike all of this down and pressure Congress to pass something. So, of course, we're going to be here. We're going to be live at noon on TV, and then later in the afternoon and evening. So, Brandy, back to you.
Matt Doherty live for us in Washington, D.C. A lot of work to do before noon, so we'll let him get to it. One of the other really interesting things that House Democrats mentioned in their press conference this morning was that when they're in the House chamber, they use voting machines to weigh in on legislation, and they have learned this morning that those voting machines were locked and will stay that way until they get permission. That's after they return from the nation's capital to the Texas Capitol. We are going to have much more on this throughout the day, hearing from President Biden, as well as those lawmakers. Republicans also will want to weigh in. Be sure to follow us on KHOU.com. We will also have breaking news on the KHOU 11 News app.